They forced a black woman to wash dishes at luxury party, not knowing her husband owned the mansion. The clinking of crystal glasses echoed in the marble hall. Laughter, rich and careless, floated through the air. And in the middle of it all, under glittering chandeliers, a woman stood hunched over a mountain of dishes. Her hands, raw from soap and scalding water, trembled with every plate she scrubbed. No one asked her name. No one cared about her dignity. To them, she was invisible, disposable. But here's the twist. What none of them knew was that the mansion they were so arrogantly parading through didn't belong to them. It belonged to her husband. And every cruel smirk, every order barked at her, was a step closer to their own humiliation. What would you do if you were forced into servitude at a place that should have celebrated your worth? What if the very people mocking you were about to choke on their arrogance in front of the world? If you believe no one should suffer this way, share this story, because silence only protects the cruel. Before that humiliating night beneath the chandeliers, before her dignity was tested, she was simply Amara, a woman who carried both grace and grit in equal measure. Amara woke each morning to the sound of church bells drifting through her neighborhood, a community where every front porch had stories carved into its wood. Children's laughter spilled into the streets, mingling with the scent of fresh bread from Mrs. Johnson's bakery at the corner. This was Amara's world, ordinary, warm, and stitched together with the quiet resilience of people who knew how to survive storms. She wasn't just someone's wife. She was an artist in her own right. On most mornings, she sketched by the kitchen window while the sun painted gold across her notebooks. Her husband, David, always teased her gently. One day, those sketches will hang in a gallery, and I'll have to line up just to get in. David was successful, yes, well built from years of risk, late nights, and sacrifice. But at home, he was simply her partner, her biggest admirer, the man who still left notes tucked under her coffee cup. Together, they dreamed not of riches but a legacy, a life where dignity meant more than diamonds. Their mansion wasn't just marble and chandeliers. To Amara, it was a symbol of their journey. Each room held memories. The scuff marks of moving boxes dragged across the floor, the laughter of nieces and nephews playing hide-and-seek, the kitchen table covered in sketches and blueprints for their shared dreams. But outside their walls, Amara often felt something colder. At the grocery store, she noticed how cashiers sometimes handed her change without meeting her eyes. At charity galas, she caught the subtle arch of brows when she walked in beside David. Whispers softened into smiles the moment she turned her head. They weren't blatant cruelties, just microaggressions brushed off easily at first. But deep down, Amara felt their sting. Her friend once asked, "Don't you ever get tired of pretending not to notice?" Amara only smiled, though her silence was heavier than words. David noticed, too. He often reminded her, people will measure you by their prejudice, not your worth. But remember, your worth was never theirs to define. Still, there was a part of her that grew wary. She knew too well how quickly admiration could turn into dismissal when skin color entered the equation. The invitations to the party came with gold-embossed letters, sealed with arrogance disguised as prestige. David, unable to attend due to business abroad, encouraged her to go anyway. "It's our home, too," he reminded her. "You shouldn't have to hide just because I'm not there." She hesitated. Something in her chest tightened when she looked at the invitation, but she brushed it off. What could really go wrong? The night arrived with a bitter wind. The mansion, her own sanctuary, glowed with lights that now felt foreign. Black cars lined the driveway, the sound of heels clicking against marble as guests streamed in, perfumes mingling with the scent of roasted lamb and champagne. Amara, dressed in a simple but elegant gown, walked down the staircase slowly. She expected to be greeted with smiles, perhaps even respect. After all, this was her home too. But the eyes that met hers weren't kind. They were curious, judgmental, dismissing, one whispered behind the glass. "Who let the help in so early?" Another laughed softly, assuming she couldn't hear. Amara swallowed hard. She straightened her back, reminding herself who she was, reminding herself that these walls stood because of her husband, her partner, her life. But deep inside, a warning bell rang. Something was coming. something she couldn't yet name. At first, Amara tried to ignore it. She told herself the whispers were just insecurity wearing fancy clothes. But as the night unfolded, the mask of politeness slipped further and further from the guests' faces. When she reached for a glass of water from the catering table, a sharply dressed woman leaned over and said with a smile too sweet to be sincere, "Oh, honey, those are for the guests. The staff usually has their own section in the back." Amara froze. She wanted to correct her, to say, "This is my house, my kitchen, my table," but her words caught in her throat. Instead, she forced a polite smile and walked away, though her chest tightened with every step. The microaggressions grew louder, bolder. A man clinked his glass and motioned for her to bring more hors d'oeuvres, mistaking her for a server. Another handed her his empty plate without a second thought. At first, she laughed it off nervously, placing the dishes aside. But deep inside, the weight grew unbearable. Every time she tried to step into conversation, someone cut her off. Every time she attempted to introduce herself, eyes glanced past her as if she weren't even there. It wasn't just ignorance. It was erasure. She felt her body stiffen, her smile becoming mechanical. In her mind, David's voice whispered, "Your worth is not theirs to measure." But it was hard to remember that when humiliation pressed down like a suffocating cloak. The worst came when a group of women gathered near the staircase, gossiping with glasses of champagne. One of them, wearing a diamond necklace that caught every flicker of the chandelier, looked at Amara and said, "I don't know why the staff always dress up for these events. It just looks off, doesn't it?" The others giggled, their laughter echoing louder than the music. Heat rushed to Amara's face. She wanted to scream, "This isn't staff attire. This is my dress. This is my home." But before she could speak, another voice cut in. "You there, the dishes in the kitchen are piling up. Would you mind lending a hand?" The words weren't a request. They were a command, sharp and dismissive, delivered as though she had no right to refuse. Time slowed. The music dulled. All she could hear was the roar of her heartbeat in her ears. Her first instinct was to walk away, to reclaim her dignity by refusing. But every eye in the room turned toward her, waiting, testing her. And in that moment, fear clashed with pride. What if she refused, only to be further humiliated? What if she fought back, and they twisted her resistance into aggression? So, with trembling hands, she obeyed. She walked into her own kitchen and picked up a plate. The porcelain felt heavier than stone. Soap burned her fingers as she scrubbed, each dish a reminder of her forced invisibility. Guests walked by, some smirking, others oblivious. A few even congratulated themselves for helping to help by dropping off their used glasses in front of her. Every scrape of a fork, every crash of a plate, chipped away at her soul. Her shoulders hunched lower, her back aching not from labor but from humiliation. At one point, a young server leaned in and whispered, "Miss, you don't have to do this." But Amara only shook her head. Tears stung her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not here, not in front of them. Hours seemed to pass in minutes. By the time she looked up, her reflection in the kitchen window was unrecognizable. The glow in her eyes dimmed, replaced by exhaustion and shame. And yet, the cruelty didn't stop there. One guest, half drunk and arrogant, wandered into the kitchen, watching her scrub. "Now that's more fitting," he said with a laugh. "Every mansion needs its help. Keeps the place running, doesn't it?" The words pierced deeper than any blade. Amara gripped the plate, so tightly she thought it might shatter. For a moment, rage surged inside her, hot, uncontrollable. She imagined hurling the dish against the marble floor, letting it explode into shards sharp enough to slice through their arrogance. But she didn't. She swallowed the fire, burying it deep, though it burned her from within. That was the point of no return. From that moment on, there was no mistaking the hostility, no pretending it was ignorance or accident. This was deliberate, cruelty parading as superiority. And as the laughter from the hall grew louder, echoing against the kitchen walls, Amara knew the night wasn't over. Something was building, something she couldn't stop, something that would change everything when the truth came crashing down. The kitchen buzzed with clattering dishes and muffled laughter from the hall. Amara's hands were raw, the scent of lemon soap clinging to her skin, but she refused to let her tears fall. Not here, not in front of them. Then, click, a camera flash. She turned sharply. A guest had wandered in, phone in hand, smirking. "Oh, this is priceless," he sneered. "The help scrubbing dishes while we toast champagne. Wait till the others see this." The room tilted. For a moment, all sound drained away, leaving only the roar of her pulse in her ears. The heat of humiliation spread across her face like fire. Laughter erupted in the hall as the photo made its rounds. Phones buzzed. Fingers pointed. The echo of mocking voices cut deeper than glass. Her chest tightened. She couldn't breathe. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every woman who had ever been reduced, every person forced into a role beneath their dignity. Amara dropped the sponge. The sound small but final. Her hands trembled as she steadied herself against the counter. Enough. She walked back into the grand hall, every eye turning as whispers rose. The chandeliers above seemed to mock her with their cruel glitter. One guest, drink in hand, raised his glass and shouted, "Our maid of honor, everyone!" The hall erupted in laughter. Her throat tightened, her vision blurred. But before she could collapse beneath the weight of it, a sound cut through the room, a sound that silenced everything. The heavy slam of the front door's opening. And there he was, David. He had arrived early from his trip, still in his travel-worn suit, but his presence filled the room with a force none could ignore. His eyes scanned the hall, confusion flickering into fury as he saw Amara, his wife, standing humiliated with soap still staining her gown. The laughter died. The smirks faded. Silence spread like wildfire. David's voice was low, controlled, but sharp enough to slice through every ounce of arrogance in the room. "Who?" he asked, his gaze locking on the crowd. "Thought it was acceptable to order my wife to wash dishes in her own home?" Gasps rippled through the hall. Glasses trembled in hands. Faces drained of color. Amara stood frozen, her heart racing, her humiliation tangled with the shock of vindication. David walked toward her, every step deliberate. He slipped off his jacket and draped it gently over her shoulders, covering the stains of soap and shame. Then he turned back to the guests, his expression a storm barely contained. "This mansion," he said, his voice rising, "is mine, ours. Every inch of marble you walked on tonight, every chandelier you bragged under, it belongs to us. And yet you dare to treat my wife as less than human." Silence. No one dared move. One man stuttered, "We didn't know." "That's the problem." David cut in sharply. "You never cared to know." The room burned with shame. Guests avoided eye contact, their arrogance crumbling into fear. The same people who had mocked her now looked like children caught stealing. Amara finally found her voice. It was steady, though it quivered with the force of everything she had endured. "You saw me standing here," she said, her voice echoing against the marble walls. "And instead of seeing a woman, a guest, a human being, you saw only what your prejudice wanted you to see." Her words hung heavy in the air, impossible to ignore. For a long moment, no one spoke. The air was thick, suffocating. Then, slowly, one by one, guests began setting down their glasses, their laughter replaced by shameful silence. But the damage was done. The illusion of grandeur, the arrogance of privilege, shattered in a single night. And Amara, though her body trembled, her spirit stood taller than it ever had before. The party ended not with applause or toasts, but with silence so heavy it seemed to press against the very walls of the mansion. Guests slipped away one by one, their laughter extinguished, their arrogance replaced by shame. The clink of heels against marble no longer sounded proud. It sounded guilty. Amara stood in the center of it all, still wrapped in David's jacket. Her body was exhausted, her hands sore, but her spirit had shifted. Something inside her had cracked open, no longer willing to shrink beneath their gaze, no longer willing to pretend. Later that night, the mansion felt quieter than usual. The chandeliers still glowed, but their light seemed softer, gentler, as if reflecting her resilience. David sat beside her at the long dining table, holding her hand in silence. He didn't offer platitudes. He didn't try to erase what happened. He simply let her breathe, knowing some wounds are too deep for easy words. Amara stared at the plates stacked neatly on the counter, plates she'd been forced to scrub while the powerful mocked her. And in their shine, she didn't see humiliation anymore. She saw defiance. She saw survival. The next day, whispers of what happened spread beyond those walls. Some guests tried to twist the story, framing it as a misunderstanding. Others stayed silent, afraid to confront the truth. But the truth was there, undeniable. In their prejudice, they had revealed themselves. For Amara, the aftermath wasn't about revenge. It was about reflection. She thought about every glance, every smirk, every assumption they'd made about her worth. And she knew this wasn't just her story. How many others had endured the same quiet erasure? How many times had people been forced into roles they didn't choose, stripped of their dignity by those too blind to see their humanity? Her pain became a mirror, one that showed not just a reflection, but the reflection of a world still scarred by arrogance and inequality. She knew she couldn't change every heart in that room, but she could speak her truth. And truth, once spoken, has a way of echoing louder than silence. Weeks later, when another gala was planned in that same mansion, Amara made a choice. She greeted the guests at the door, not in a gown that blended quietly into background, but in a dress radiant and bold. She walked the halls with her head high, her voice steady. And this time, when people looked at her, they saw not the help, not a stranger, but a woman unshaken, standing in her rightful place. But here's the question that lingers, the one that should unsettle us all. Why did it take the revelation of her husband's wealth for them to respect her? Why wasn't her humanity enough on its own? That is the weight of the story. That is the wound it leaves us with. Because Amara's humiliation is not an isolated event. It's part of a pattern that repeats in workplaces, schools, neighborhoods, and homes. A pattern that thrives in silence. And so I leave you with this. This story isn't just hers. It's ours. A reflection of a world that still decides worth by skin, by class, by assumptions that dehumanize. If it unsettled you, then the conversation cannot end here. Share this. Talk about it. Because awareness is a first step to change. But tell me, if you were there that day, would you have stayed silent or stood up for her? The night's noise faded, but the sting of humiliation lingered long after the last guest had gone. What remained was silence, thick, almost suffocating, as Amara stood in her own living room, the smell of soap still clinging to her hands. The mansion felt different now. Those chandeliers, once symbols of triumph, seemed to hang heavier. The marble floor, once gleaming with pride, now felt cold beneath her bare feet. This was her home. Yet for hours, it had been twisted into a stage for her degradation. David stayed close, his presence steady, his fury simmering beneath quiet words. "You never should have gone through this," he said, voice raw with guilt. But Amara shook her head. "It's not just me. It's what so many go through every day, without someone walking in to stop it." That truth hit harder than any insult. In the days that followed, whispers of the night spread. Some tried to erase their cruelty with excuses. "We didn't know. It was just a mistake." Others stayed silent, avoiding the shame of confrontation. But no amount of denial could wash away what had been revealed. The rot beneath the glamour. And yet, Amara did not retreat. She began to walk her community with new purpose. At the market, she held her head higher, meeting every glance without flinching. At church, when women asked gently if she was all right, she spoke honestly, not to gather pity, but to spark conversations about dignity and respect. One Sunday, she stood before the congregation and told her story, not as a wife of a wealthy man, not as the owner of a mansion, but as a woman who had been stripped of her humanity in plain sight. Her words were not polished speeches. They were raw, trembling, soaked in truth. And people listened, because Amara's humiliation was not unique. It was a mirror held up to countless others who had been unseen, unheard, erased in rooms they had every right to belong in. And the question she asked haunted everyone. Why did it take wealth, a title, or a man's presence for her to be respected? Why wasn't her humanity enough? That is the wound her story leaves us with. A wound that asks whether we, individually and collectively, allow dignity to be conditional or whether we honor it as every person's birthright. Months later, the mansion hosted another gathering. But this time, it wasn't for the same crowd of elites. It was for the community Amara loved. The neighbors who had cheered her on, the children who once played hide-and-seek in the halls, the women who knew too well the sting of being underestimated. Music filled the rooms again, but it was different, joyful, not arrogant. The chandeliers glowed, but their light felt warm, welcoming. And at the center of it all stood Amara, radiant in a bold dress, no longer shrinking, no longer silenced. She hadn't just reclaimed her home. She had reclaimed her story. But here's the truth that must not be forgotten. One woman's reclamation does not erase the countless others still forced into silence, still enduring humiliation with no one to shield them. And so I leave you with this. This story isn't just Amara's. It's a reflection of the world we live in, a world that too often measures worth by wealth, race, or status. If it unsettled you, then the conversation cannot end here. Share this. Talk about it. Because awareness is the first step to change. But tell me, if you were there that night, watching as they forced her to scrub dishes in her own home, would you have stayed silent, or would you have stood up?